Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Subhanallah. Like, doesn't it taste beautiful? Like the Burda Sharifa, sending salawat upon the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. You know, some of our mashayikh, they would say that they could smell it. They could smell it. I remember going, and you know, sometimes you feel ashamed. I remember I took a group, I was the ustaz on the group, mashallah, for whatever that term is worth. And I went and I took a group to Al-Aqsa. And I remember one of the brothers from Manchester, and we were inside where the rock is, and it's reported that where the Prophet ﷺ's blessed feet were when he lifted. It's reported, so people differ, historians differ. And I remember he came out and he was in tears and he said, I smelt it. And he wouldn't say what he said, because I smelt it. And he walked on, he was in tears, and I thought to myself, subhanAllah, here's me thinking about the reports on the khilaf of the historians, and he smelt it. You know, and so, you know, Allah give us that love for the Prophet ﷺ. Allah give us the shifa of the Prophet ﷺ. Allah give us death in Madinatul Munawwara. Allah allow us to take our children and introduce our children to the Prophet ﷺ. You know, wallahi, I wish if I could take my children to Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam in this world, to the great gathering of the Prophet ﷺ, and in the hereafter, and I can take him and I can say, Ya Rasulullah, hadha ibni, this is my son. I wish if I could present them to the Prophet ﷺ, and I have husnul dhan in my Lord that Allah is Kareem, and my Rasul is Kareem ﷺ, that Allah will grant me that, insha'Allah ta'ala. Allahumma ameen. Hadith al-Rabi', very quickly, the fourth hadith in this silsila sharifa, عن أبي عبد الرحمن عبد الله بن مسعود رضي الله عنه أنه قال حدثنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم وهو الصادق المصدوق عليه الصلاة والسلام إن أحدكم يجمع خلقه في بطن أمه 40 يوما نطفة ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك ثم يكون مضغة مثل ذلك ثم يرسل إليه الملك فينفخ فيه الروح ويؤمر ب4 كلمات بكتب رزقه وأجله وعمله وشقي أو سعيد فوالله الذي لا إله غيره إن أحدكم ليعمل بعمل أهل الجنة حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق عليه الكتاب فيعمل بعمل أهل النار فيدخلها وإن أحدكم ليعمل بعمل أهل النار حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق عليه الكتاب فيعمل بعمل أهل الجنة فيدخلها. Slightly long hadith, mentioned in both Bukhari and Muslim. The other reports to do with this hadith that are extremely important are mentioned in Sahih Muslim. There are about 4 other hadith that are to do with this hadith that you have to know in order to understand this hadith properly. Now, in this hadith, which is reported on the authority of Abdullah ibn Masud radiyallahu anhu, he said that the Prophet ﷺ, who was a Sadiq al-Masduq, he said, indeed, you, every one of you, each one of you, his creation was gathered, or his being is gathered in the stomach of his mother 40 yawman, for 40 days. And then the Prophet ﷺ says, nutfatan, as a nutfa. Now a nutfa, translating in English is almost irrelevant, but the point is it's a drop. It's a drop of sperm and of ovum. That's what a nutfa is, that you're first a drop. ثُمَّ يَكُونُ عَلَقَةً. And an alaqa is something that sort of clings. It clings. So first you're a nutfa, then you're an alaqa. Now here the Prophet ﷺ said, mithla dhalik, like that. Like that what? Like that 40, like that 40. So bear that in mind. So you got 40 and 40 now. ثُمَّ يَكُونُ مُدْغَةً. And then you became a mudgha, the Prophet ﷺ was saying. And a mudgha is like a chewed substance. That's what it looks like. Just a piece of flesh. Mithla dhalik, like that. And so now, ثُمَّ يُرْسَلْ إِلَيْهِ الْمَلَكِ. Then an angel comes, فَيَنْفُخُ فِيهِ الرُّوحِ. And blows into you the soul, or fihi, in the fetus, blows into the fetus the soul. وَيُؤْمَرْ بِأَرْبَعِ كَلِمَاتٍ. And then the angel is commanded with 4 things. To do what? بِكَتْبِ رِزْقِهِ. To write i.e. essentially the destiny of that fetus, his or her, but for here it's going to be his rizq, wa ajalihi, how long he's going to live, when he's going to die, wa amalihi, and his acts, wa shaqiyun aw sa'id, if that person is going to be wretched or that person is going to be felicitous. That these things are already written after this moment that you are mudgha, and when the soul is breathed into you from the angel. Now the second part of the hadith we'll leave for a second. Just for a minute, let's focus on the first part. The reason why is because if you look at traditional commentaries on this hadith, the most famous being Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, the great Shafi'i jurist of Cairo, radiallahu anhu warda. And those of you that have been to Cairo may have been lucky enough to go to his Mazar al-Sharif, buried, rahimahullah ta'ala, next to Ibn Ata'illah, radiallahu anhu warda. One of the great Qadi of the Shafi'iyah, great Imam of Hadith, mashallah. But they did not have certain empirical studies of the process of how a fetus develops within the mother of a child to really think about this too much beyond what it was. So they looked at it and they said, well, this is what it is, and they moved on. They didn't need to think about it more. However, in recent times, it's become more of a problem. Why? Because there are people that study science. They would say that we have certain empirical data that suggests that this all happens in and around 40 days. And so here your Prophet seems to be saying 40 and then another 40 and then another 40. And so that's different. But here are some of our ulama that respond to that. They respond to that by explaining that you have to read this hadith with other ahadith, particularly those in Sahih Muslim in the chapter of Al-Qadr, because this hadith deals with destiny. And so the chapter, if you look in the hadith of Al-Qadr in Sahih Muslim, you'll find these ahadith there, where the Prophet ﷺ actually mentions all four of these things happening in 40. And so then they discuss what mithla dhalik means. And they say that when the Prophet ﷺ said 40 like that, he didn't mean an additional 40, he meant that 40. Meaning that within 40 days you are nutfa, within 40 days you become an alaqa, and within 40 days you become a mudgha. That all three of those things, and in one hadith, 45 days. So between 40 and 45 days, based upon the ahadith of our Master sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the development of this embryo essentially is nutfa, alaqa, and mudgha. And then the angel comes. So that was just in case you ever find yourself on one of these troll websites and the Christian is asking these questions about, oh look, the Prophet ﷺ said this, it's contradicting. It's not contradicting at all. That being said, by the way, that even if something was in hadith, like that, we can just answer that because it actually is what it is. I didn't answer it like that because science has said something that the hadith is saying different, and now I need to square it. We don't square our nusul or our tradition with science. With the aql is different, but not with science. And there's a reason for that. And why I'm saying that is important, because I'm saying it because it actually is like that in light of those other ahadith. And that's why I said it's important to read it in its entire bab, and it gives you a clearer picture. But the reason why with science it's different is because even though you can have observable data for things, it doesn't necessarily make them fact. Like for example, if the studies on certain things were absolute, that we observed every single possible instant, a complete observation, not a single aspect was left out, fine, that's different. That's different, because that's a level of certainty. We accept that within our tradition also. That for us is a dalil, what we would call istiqra' tam. That would be a complete inference. But if your inference was not complete, it was incomplete, you're basing it upon the scientific method, which is testing something over and over and over again until you're relatively happy with the conclusion. That's what it is. Now, if you have that, for us, in terms of our epistemic value that we would give to that, it wouldn't match up to what we would consider to be a proof that you have to consider to be certain. We wouldn't. We would put that into dhanniyat, into speculative proofs, and we would deal with them accordingly as our ulama have done. That's what we would do. So the reason why I say that is because we're not Christians on the one hand that have to be scared of science, No, we can look at it and we can absorb much of it and we can take it into consideration, yes. But at the same time, we're not subservient to anyone's science, because science is a field of knowledge. Our ulama were already dealing with the scientific method in the past. They were dealing with that as a mode of an evidence. An incomplete inference was a discussion within our framework, our framework of knowledge, our theory of knowledge. It's there. So we don't really have to be worried or scared or think or have to figure out how to square things. We really don't. We're not in a position of inferiority. We really never have been. We just thought we were because we didn't really read it. Was probably the main problem. So we don't ever have to feel in that situation. Then the hadith goes on where the angel blows in and the soul, and it is commanded with 4 things. The first thing is your rizq. So when Zayd, Bichara Zayd, in every example it's always Zayd. It's always Zayd. Daraba Zayd. Zayd is Darib, Madrub. Kad they were throwing him off the roof. I always sometimes think to myself, Zayd. And I remember my friend Mullah Bilal, his son's name is Zayd. And he's a Maulana as well. And so I said to him, why did you name your son Zayd? And I thought to myself, for his entire life, he's the example in every book where it doesn't matter what happens, always Zayd, Bichara Zayd. And may Allah reward those whose name is Zayd. It's a beautiful name. Zayd is a beautiful name. Zayd ibn Harith radiallahu anhu, was essentially fostered by the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. The Prophet called him his Ibn, alayhi salatu wasalam, so he freed him, alayhi salatu wasalam, radiallahu anhu wardah. So let's say Zayd, when he is a fetus, after 40 and 45 days around this period and the soul is breathed in, these things are written. Now the hadith carries on and says that your destiny is written for you such that somebody from you will do an act of Jannah until between that person and Jannah is an arm's length. They're just about to go to Jannah. They've been acting like Ahlul Jannah their entire life. فَيَسْبِقُ عَلَيْهِ الْكِتَابِ. But then destiny will kick in. Destiny will take over. Destiny will proceed. And when that happens, فَيَعْمَلْ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ النَّارِ فَيَدْخُلُهَا. He will do the acts of the people of fire and he will enter into them. Subhanallah al-Azim. Anyway, وَإِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ and someone from you لَيَعْمَلْ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ النَّارِ. He will do an act. Jazakumullahu khairan. He will do an act from the act of the people of fire. حَتَّى مَا يَكُونْ بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَهَا إِلَّا ذِرَاعٌ. He will do the acts of the people of fire such that there is no greater distance between him and Jahannam except an arm's length. فَيَسْبِقُ عَلَيْهِ الْكِتَابِ. And then the book, i.e. destiny, will proceed, will kick in. فَيَعْمَلْ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ فَيَدْخُلُهَا. He will do the act of Jannah and he will enter into it. And so somebody can now ask a question and say, if you look at Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, he mentions that the decree, in fact, I'll tell you what he said. By the way, when he talked about, there's a nice point that he mentions that I thought was very nice. He said that, when it comes to the person that is doing the acts of the people of Jannah, until he's so close to it, and then suddenly يَسْبِقُ عَلَيْهِ الْكِتَابِ, and then he does the acts of the people of fire and enters the fire. He says, أَنَّ هَذَا قَدْ يَقَعُ فِي نَادِرٍ مِنَ النَّاسِ. He says this happens very, very rarely. Very, very rarely. لَا أَنَّهُ غَالِبْ فِيهِمْ. This is not the common circumstance or situation. He says, وَذَلِكَ مِنْ لُطْفِ اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. This is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's gentleness. And he says that the inqilabun nas min ash-sharri ila al-khair kathiran. He goes, however, the change from somebody being of Ahlul Nar and then in the last moment turning towards Ahlul Jannah and entering Jannah, he says that's the common situation, that's the norm, that's the majority, and that this is from Allah's lutf, that if it was on His justice, it's different. And then he quotes the hadith. Well, even there's the verse in the Quran, Inna rahmati sabaqat ghadabi, that's a hadith, in that in my rahmah precedes my ghadab, my anger. So he says that from the perspective, and he quotes a couple of hadith, that from that perspective, that it's moreover. But then the hadith, he says, وَفِي هَذَا الْحَدِيثِ إِثْبَاتُ الْقَدَرِ. Now this affirms the destiny, predestiny. I know normally I do half Urdu on this, but it's only because I just focused on English, so please forgive me for that today. كَمَا هُوَ مَذْهَبُ أَهْلِ السُنَّةِ. He says this is the madhab of Ahl Sunnah, that we affirm the divine decree. And he says, وَأَنَّ جَمِيعَ الْوَاقِعَاتِ بِقَضَاءِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَقَدَرِهِ, that everything that's mentioned in terms of Allah's qadr, the khair of it, the shar of it, all of it, the good, the harm, all of that. He says we affirm all of that. And he says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that He will not be asked amma yaf'al, about what He does, وَهُمْ يُسْأَلُونَ, but they will be asked. And he says that there's no وَلَا اِعْتِرَادَ عَلَيْهِ فِي مُلْكِي يَفْعَلُ فِي مُلْكِي مَا يَشَاءُ. And this is the position of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah when it comes to the divine decree, that ultimately, whether we understood this or not, because he goes on to say, Al-Qadr sirrun min asrarillah. This is the position of Ahlul Hadith, not Ahl Hadith in Pakistan, India, but the Ahlul Hadith, generally speaking, that did not like to engage in anything philosophical or anything when it came to this discussion, particularly when it came to Al-Qadr. Even the greatest of the mutakallimun, of the scholars of Kalam, when it came to Qadr, were always very, very reserved. They had their debates, their discussions, etc. But when it came to Al-Qadr, you could say that the area that they were the most cautious in was Al-Qadr. And the reason for this is because the Prophet ﷺ was very harsh when it came to Al-Qadr. That you affirm Al-Qadr and you don't dwell within it too much, you don't think about it too much. However, there are discussions that can be had that can be helpful to understand certain things. But anyway, before we get there, he says, لِأَنَّ الْقَدَرْ سِرٌ مِّنْ أَسْرَارِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, that this is a secret from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He has prevented from it. He put a hijab over the uqul of the khalq, He said, from them to understand what this is. وَوَاجِبْ عَلَيْنَا أَن نَقِفَ. He says for us it's important that we do we have tawaqquf in the mas'ala, that we don't go further than that, we just affirm. Hatta he says that that nobody has ilm of it, and so for us we affirm it, and we do not as he says here, وَكُلُّ ذَلِكَ مِمَّا يَجِبُ الْإِيمَانُ بِهِ وَأَمَّا كَيْفِيَةُ ذَلِكَ وَصِفَةُ فَعِلْمُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And he says, as for what it's like, etc., and this is very Ahlul Hadith position. And he says, what its description is, how it is, etc., this is all in the knowledge of God. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. And he quotes the verse of the Quran that you can't encompass Allah's knowledge. Wallahu a'lam. So that's very important, and that's a position of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, which is just to affirm that Allah has predestined these things for me, and we know. However, there are some things absolutely that we have no role in. That we have no role in it at all. Like for example, where I was born, I don't have a role to play in that. And by role, I'm using that word very specifically here. When I'm going to die, I don't have any, there's nothing on my part. There's nothing. I don't earn that. It just happens. Ultimately, how much rizq I get, is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, predestined and decreed. And that's just the secret within creation, and there's nothing that we could truly know about that, really. And so we affirm that, and we leave that as it is, and we move on. However, there is one question, and that's all we'll mention, and we'll finish here, that some people do have when they're talking about decree, is that sometimes people feel that this extends, or they misunderstand how this extends to everything in life. So for example, your acts, right? They'll say your amal was written. So if your amal is written, then if I do good acts, it's not really me doing it, it's God that's predestined it. And if I do evil acts, then it's not really me doing it, it's God that has written that, and therefore I shouldn't really be punished or given Jannah for it or Jahannam for it. Why would I be? Why am I accountable for these sorts of things? And that's a very valid question. And even in this position, there were certain ulama that used to say, well, this is you've been asked to do it, you just do it. You've been asked to affirm the decree, you just do it. But some of our ulama explain this, and they explain that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree, how some of the ulama have understood this and explained it, is that the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a jabr. It's not something that is enforced upon you in that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wrote something and therefore you are compelled to do it in that same way. But it's that God knew in His infinite knowledge that you would have done X, Y, and Z, and God has already written that in the Lawh al-Mahfuz. And so you are accountable because you were going to do what you did. Allah gave you a freedom. Now that small element of freedom that within the human consciousness has been a great debate within our theological history, within our history of our theology, has been a great debate. And some of our ulama, particularly the Hanafis, who probably arguably were some of the most nuanced scholars when it came to trying to understand this issue right here. Because for us, we do not even believe in our Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah tradition that we create our own acts. Like for example, if an act is created on my part, we don't believe that I created it, but that it was Allah. That Allah is both the cause and the effect. So if Allah is the cause and the effect, then what role am I playing in that? So some of the scholars describe this within what they call the theory of kasb, which is that you earned it. How did you earn it? And here some of the ulama mention that within the consciousness of man, that there is a petitioning, that there is this iltifat at the most subtle level towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that petitions God at an azima of type. It's an azima, it's a turning towards God. And that, let's say for example, I want to grab this bottle of water. What bottle of water is there? Now I want to grab it. Now my grabbing it ultimately is God who causes an effect, because He is al-wahid fi af'alihi. Allah is the only one. However, what there is a relationship between me and this bottle. And relations are not, they don't have to be created. Relations are there. They have a thubutiyah, meaning that for example, you're sat in front of me, I'm sat in front of you, but you being in front of me is not a thing. In frontness is not a thing. Can you see it? Can you smell it? Can you touch it? No, but it is real. And so likewise, I can do an act which is real, and I'm really accountable for it, but I didn't create it because it's not a thing to create. Now that may sound or seem a little bit, but it's important to understand that how they understood that was you could have a real relationship with your acts, such that you are really accountable for them, whilst it still being God that was the cause and effect of that act. And that was important to understand, because on the one hand, preservation of Tawheed was absolutely paramount, but on this and the qadr, that Allah is the only one that acts and His decree is all that can happen. However, at the same time, preserving the fact that we are accountable for our acts and what we do. Those two things are not mutually contradictory. They do not contradict each other. They just have to be understood. And if somebody says to me, don't really like that, don't really want to understand it, find it too difficult to understand, then you do as the Ahlul Hadith said, which is you affirm it and you be quiet and you move on. And you don't think about it. But if somebody is curious, and many people are curious, then you have to understand that there are always ways to understand it, ways that our ulama understood it. That when you, and remember this, and for me by the way, some people think this is something strange. For me this was like one of the greatest lessons of tasawwuf in my life, which is the idea that ultimately within my consciousness, that there is this desire ultimately to do something. And so there's a petitioning to God that I want that, and God, His sunnah is He will fulfill that. That is His sunnah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you what you want. And so I want to pick up the bottle of water, I pick up the bottle of water, but it's ultimately God that is making all of that happen and actually doing all of that. But I'm still accountable. So if I throw this bottle of water at somebody and it hits them, I'm accountable because it was ultimately me that made that choice. Now, the more that people go into that, the more suddenly it becomes confusing and the more hard it is to get out of a rabbit hole. And so that's why I mentioned it sometimes that with these sort of things, it's important sometimes that for many people it is better just to affirm it and just to move on and to find. But the reason why I mentioned it, by the way, is so that you know that there is discussion on it. That it's not like, oh, the Prophet mentioned something, we don't really understand it and we're just moving on. No, there can be a way of understanding it. But it just means that if you want to, If that's something you're interested in doing, then you can try to understand that. But in a nutshell, if I could summarize, our position on the decree is that everything is predestined, everything is written. However, that predestination, that whatever was predestined, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wrote with His knowledge of what we would have done with our acts. And so we are not doing our acts because we are forced to, and therefore this is some sort of, and even if it was, by the way, it would not be injustice. Even if you were forced and then you were thrown into the fire of hell, it would not be injustice, because Allah is Malik. يَفْعَلُ فِي مُلْكِ مَا يَشَاءُ. You might not like it and it may not be nice, but it's not true either. And this is not what it is. But even if it was the case, it would still not be just, because what is just and what is unjust? Who decides what is just and what's unjust? What could be unjust? This is my bottle of water, I can do what I want with it. I can spill it if I want, I can drink it if I want. I can do what I want, it's mine. At least you could say there's environment and you're harming the environment, wasting plastic. There's some impact on something else. But if I own all the environment's mine, everything is mine. Allah is al-Malik, yaf'alu fi mulki ma yasha. He can do absolutely whatever He wants. Whatever He does is good. That's the position of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acts with hikmah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a sunnah. So it's important to understand that for us, how we understand this is that whatever we do is ultimately by our choice, and we are accountable for it. But whatever we were going to do has already been written by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for an understanding. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from going astray. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He allows us to honor the words of His Prophet ﷺ and forgive us for any mistakes that we made. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He overlooks our shortcomings. Any mistakes that I made are from my own shortcomings and from shaitan, and anything that I have said that is correct is from Allah and His kindness and His mercy. Jalla sha'nuhu wa jalla fil ula wa sallallahu wa sallim wa barik ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Ameen bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahim.